think of one coach who is not upset at all about this year's transfer portal cycle, and that has got to be Mike Norvell at Florida State. For a little bit more perspective on what's going on with the Seminoles, let's welcome in our friend Brendan Sonnone from Noles 247. I mentioned Mike Norvell. I mean, he goes from hot seat to the hot transfer portal destination. What changed, Brendan?
It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that Mike Norvell and Florida State have had the last few years. This was originally like a necessity for FSU as it was doing a rebuild with Mike Norvell and had the disastrous 2020 season. You want to get some experience, start turning the roster over a little bit. Then you start having success with your transfers. Jermaine Johnson comes to mind as probably the best example for Florida State, who went from being a rotational player at Georgia to being a first-round draft pick and an all-ACC performer at Florida State. So then all of a sudden you're able to start attracting a slightly better brand of transfer. Those guys perform well. Jared Verse this year, Trey Benson, Johnny Wilson. And then again, it leads to even more traction in the transfer portal where you're getting a higher caliber of players. So just one thing that kind of keeps expounding on itself a little bit, keeps adding. This wasn't originally the plan for Mike Norvell. I don't think he wanted to get 10 plus players every year in the portal, but that's what's happened, and it's worked really well for him to date.
I think Florida State, I mean, personally, it's a fascinating thing to watch because we've seen schools have success in the portal and contend. We saw that with TCU this year, but this is the first time really we've ever seen a contender, or at least a potential contender, be built through portal gains. As Brendan said, it used to be a tool of survival for Florida State. Mike Norvell needed this to advance his program and to stay on his feet at a place that had churned through coaches pretty quickly a couple years before. And now it's a tool of contention. They're bringing in legitimate championship caliber players like Fentrell, Cypress, and Jermaine Byers to aid them in their push for an ACC championship. So it'll be really fascinating to see going into 2023 if this experiment of the transfer portal can result in a legitimate college football playoff contender. And we haven't seen that before, and I think this would be a very fascinating result if Florida State was to find success ultimately with it.
Well, Chris, I'm going to tell you what. I was hanging out one time at the University of Memphis with my guy, Dan Lanning, and he takes me in a room, and he says, "You got to see this." And I go in there with my wife, and Mike Norvell is talking to a bunch of recruits, and he's got it pumping. He's got it going on. I leave the room with Dan Lanning, but my wife stays in the room with Mike Norvell, and I thought she was going to get in the transfer portal. I had to re-recruit her to get her to go out. So I'm not surprised that Norvell is having the success that he's having recruiting. He's an electric guy. He's a dynamic leader, and he knows exactly what he's doing in building his program.
Okay, we might need to change that graphic there at the bottom. It says 45 players transfer. It looks like it's going to be 46 there, too, with Carl's wife. But, I mean, along those same lines, Brendan, something you said kind of stuck out to me. You know, he brought in 9 transfers this year, 14 last year. You said that it wasn't the intention for him to continually bring in that many. Why not? If it ain't broke, right?
So initially, yeah, he wanted to build through the high school ranks, right? And that's how it's always been done. One thing that I really like about Mike Norvell is he's super adaptable and malleable. Like, he will figure out ways to survive and to adjust and to tweak his program. And I think what he saw with Florida State's recruiting efforts in the transfer portal, they had so much success, not just getting quality players for a year, but quality players for 2 or 3 years, guys who were multi-season contributors. And once he saw, like, okay, you can get a safer prospect, if you will, someone who has a little bit more a known commodity to them, like a Fabian Lovett, who was a part-time starter at Mississippi State. Well, he's going to be going into his 4th year at Florida State next season, and he's an all-ACC performer the last 2 seasons at defensive tackle. So FSU starts adding those type of guys. Mike Norvell sees that this is something that works, and mentioned earlier, like, he started to attract a higher caliber of recruit. Like, yeah, it just made sense. It was this way of finding a little bit of value in the margins where you could, maybe other college football teams weren't finding that value. I personally, I don't know, I'll throw this to Hummer, but like, I think that you can see teams starting to put more and more emphasis on the portal because you can get a guy for multiple years who's already a known commodity, and you don't have the risk of him leaving because of the one-time transfer. I think that's super valuable, man.
Yeah, we've seen schools take that to the extreme. I'm thinking Texas State signing an all-portal class a couple of years ago. because there is value in being able to know somebody's going to be in your roster long term. But I think schools like Florida State, schools like TCU, schools like USC, schools like LSU are finding more of a balance in that range of signing 8 to 10, 8 to 12 plug and play contributors on the two deep. I think the transfer portal for a lot of schools, at least the smart ones, is a way to address holes in your depth chart for both the short and the long term. I think what gets lost about Florida State a little bit in their portal success is, as Brandon said, there's been some developmental wins. I think people forget Jordan Travis, who turned into legitimately one of the best quarterbacks in college football this year, was a developmental project at Florida State. We thought he was going to get replaced a couple years ago by Mackenzie Melton. And now he's back in his 6th season for college football heading into 2023. And he's on my short list as a Heisman favorite. I think he has legitimately turned into an NFL draft prospect. And that's thanks to Mike Norvell's developing. So you're seeing teams both add immediate contributors who might be around for a year or two, but also adding pieces to their two deep who can help you this year, help you next year, and maybe be a starter down the line. So it's a really nice balance for programs, and it's a way to know what you're getting. High school recruits are clay, you got to mold them, but in this case, you know exactly what you're getting in somebody who's been in college for a while. So it's a very valuable tool.
One of the biggest things, guys, when you're looking at recruiting in terms of how many guys you're going to get from the portal versus high school, I still think it's going to always come down to your positional need. If you need an edge guy, then you just got to get an edge guy. It might be a really great recruiting year that year in the state of Florida, and you can get some really talented kids. It may be a thinner year, and it may be some guys available to you in the portal. I think that Florida State and Coach Norvell is showing the depth of being able to go into high school and develop a kid, but also being able to go into the portal and find the kids that are going to fit the culture that he's built, that are plug and play guys like Jared Verse, who came in and did some huge things for him. But so I think that's what it comes down to when you're going recruiting. It's just about the talent, and it's just about, can the kid play high level football for your school and in that conference you're in.
Yeah, I mentioned the difference between how many players Mike Norvell brought in between last year, 14, this year, 9, but they're number 1 in the rankings this year because the guys that they brought in are just that impactful, and, you know, we rated them really high. But Chris, you mentioned about kind of this sweet spot, this Goldilocks amount of bringing in recruits while also bringing in some guys in the transfer portal. Brendan, you're boots on the ground, you're on the scene. When it comes to Florida State, if there are pros and cons that come with bringing in transfer portals, let's do the devil's advocate. What's the con when it comes to bringing in a lot of guys that you didn't initially recruit fresh out of high school?
So the con for me is, you talk about chemistry, and that's such, I'm probably going to overuse this word in this explanation. It's such a difficult thing to determine what chemistry is going to, how it's going to occur, how a different player is going to impact the overall culture of a program. It's an intangible that you really can't quite measure. But what Mike Norvell has done well is figure out guys, like, they've been very selective in the transfer portal. Now, the con to that point, I believe, is that FSU has taken maybe a handful of guys who, whether they haven't been ideal fits chemistry-wise, or maybe have had some injury issues, because normally if you're on the transfer portal, there's a reason why it may not have worked out previously at your previous institution. So like Mackenzie Milton and Andrew Parchment, there were guys at key positions who didn't work out, and you had to adjust on the fly because they either had some baggage, some injury issues, whatnot. I think that's kind of the negative side of the transfer portal, is you take someone in for a year, you don't quite know what you're going to get with them, and you're expecting them to help out a ton. If you miss, then you're kind of you're floating for a little bit. You're trying to tread water, and that could be problematic, obviously.
It's a risk.
Could we make the argument, though, the other way? Could we say that you're taking a bigger risk taking a high school kid because we don't know if he's going to be good enough? We don't know if he's going to adjust to going to class. We don't know how his personality is going to be. Does he love to play, or did he just love to be recruited? Guys that have been in the portal, we have a resume and evidence of could they produce at that level. We have a college transcript that says, does this guy go to class and can he handle the academics? So on the flip side, I think right now in this market that you're taking a bigger risk on whether a high school kid can pan out or not than you are if a transfer portal kid can pan out.
I think when you talk about a cultural standpoint and potentially affecting a locker room, this is where college teams that do a really good job of advanced scouting separate themselves. That is a thing that gets lost in this process. Everybody, I think, just thinks people show up in the portal, colleges get excited, and they send out those offers. A lot of these schools have departments set up to pre-scout potential transfer portal players for weeks, if not months in advance. And part of that is doing a character background check, because the process is so condensed that you really only have 2.5 weeks to recruit and get to know somebody. So you have to know ahead of time if that player is a character fit for your locker room. And I think the teams that have found success in the portal have both, yes, they found impact players that can play immediately and help, but they've also found people who aren't going to severely affect the locker room culture. And that isn't the case everywhere. Texas, for example, took 2 former Alabama players this offseason who clearly did not work out from a cultural perspective and did not help them much this year. So you have to get those things right still from an off-field perspective if you want to have a cohesive locker room, especially if you're going to go portal heavy. And teams like TCU, Florida State, UCLA have done a really nice job of that.
Yeah.
Now, Chris, here's the thing, though.
What?
Those 2 guys from Alabama that went to Texas, we did have the evidence that they could be a culture problem. He just made a decision to take them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's
the calculus you have to make, and if you make it wrong, it can really affect your locker room, and I think it did.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, we talked about this when we did our transfer portal palooza in early December when this window originally opened up, is that if you're all of a sudden, if you're a coaching staff and you're finding out today that there is a player in there and you haven't done any homework on him, you're already late, right? I mean, this is part of the process is you have to do your homework during the season, and we're 5 years into the transfer portal now, and so we kind of understand how the process works. But what I find incredibly interesting is just the drastically different mindsets and theories of these coaches, right? We have a guy like Dabo Swinney who famously is, doesn't love the portal. We don't see him enter the portal and bring some players in nearly as often as a other guy in the conference, Mike Norvell, who seems to love it and understands the importance of it. Brendan, you follow the ACC very closely. How perplexing is it from your standpoint to see so many different theories about how to use the portal?
I think it makes sense because you can build a roster in so many different ways. And it's fair to note that Clemson has recruited at a different caliber than Florida State has from the high school ranks for quite a bit now. So it's a different, and they've already had a culture established, a way of doing things. So it makes sense that Clemson is doing it its way. I am a little curious as to why Dabo Swinney has taken such a hard stance on it. They need to be a little bit versatile and adaptable, I think. But there is something super interesting to me and poetic that, the ACC runs through Clemson right now, deservedly so, but Florida State is knocking on the door. FSU is making an attempt to unseat Clemson and is doing so rapidly and quickly with the way the roster's ascended. FSU is coming off a 10-win season, and it's done it in just a drastically different manner of recruiting by using the transfer portal. This class of FSU was put together this cycle. It's the number 1 transfer class for a reason. There's a ton of talented players that have been used to, as both Chris and Carl have said, like to supplement needs for Florida State. So it's going to be interesting if FSU has reloaded and upgraded its roster enough to knock off Dabo Swinney, who has decided to basically sit still or stand still and go into this season with his roster intact.
Every time I see a big-time player go in the portal and I see Clemson not go after him, I do cringe a little bit and wonder, can he continue to keep it going the way he has? But he has dug his heels in on how he's going to build his roster and complete his program. But you have to know that he's serious about winning because he goes out and he gets Garrett Riley as his offensive coordinator. He believes wholeheartedly that his culture, that his program, that is the way to build it, that has been successful for him. And so we will see if Florida State going completely the other way to the transfer portal can knock Clemson off its perch in the ACC. But I can tell you right now, Clemson has 7 of the last 8. And until Florida State beats them, we have to say that Dabo is doing it his way, and he's had a lot of success doing it.
Man, Carl, you're making so many great points, but the chat is still losing their minds about this whole Mike Norvell story. Is there any other little nugget that you can provide us? I'm still losing my mind about it, too. What was happening in Memphis with all of these coaches?
I'm going to tell you what, Mike Norvell had a great staff. Like I told you, at the time, Oregon head coach Dan Lannon, who's a great friend of mine, was his linebacker coach. A lot of the quality football coaches on that staff. And so he was so intense. He was so organized and so well thought out in the way he was talking, recruiting to the families that he had on campus that week. I know he had a bunch of guys jump in the boat and commit to Memphis that week. He had a big time program there. That team ended up going undefeated and they lost in the Cotton Bowl. I can't remember who they lost to. And then that parlayed him into the Florida State job. But I was not surprised at all. It's why I picked Florida State to win 10 games this year, because I knew that Mike Norvell was dynamic.
All right, we got a couple questions here for Brendan in the chat. Can you see Mike Norvell winning a title in the next 5 years? Is this transfer portal strategy going to work long term? What do you think?
I think so. I would have said no a year ago because I thought that it was still a little bit too much of a turn and burn kind of deal where you were losing too much each year to have continuity and consistency. But the culture that he's established at Florida State has proven to be something that has an upwards trajectory. The things are moving in a direction that is positive, and transfers have been a huge part of cultivating that culture. I think that's what's made me turn on that idea a little bit. He's had success. He's brought in guys like Jermaine Johnson, like Jared Verse, Fabian Lovett. These are all guys who've become team captains or team leaders to some extent, or some extent or the other in the last couple of years, and that's huge. Like that's big that you have guys coming into your program and that they are becoming faces of your program. And like I mentioned earlier, it's now leading to bringing in a higher caliber of athlete, a better caliber of athlete, guys with more upside, both as high school recruits, but in the transfer portal as well. So is it a sustainable formula? I mean, we'll see. There haven't been a whole lot of teams that have sustained long-term success through the portal. It's still pretty new, but I love the way Florida State is handling it, the way they're supplementing needs, the way they found that, as Chris mentioned, that sweet spot of about 10 or so guys each year. I think it's working out really well. And yeah, I think Mike Norvell has a legitimate chance to win a national title at FSU now based on the work he's done in the portal.
And those guys are sticking around, too. I mean, Jared Verse was not just a one-year Band-Aid. He's sticking around for a year, too, so we'll see what happens there. Before we let you go, though, very important question here. The people want to know, which one of those bottles goes down the smoothest?
Ooh. Anything Old Forester related. I'm going to give a shout out to Old Forester. Probably 1910 or 1920 are really, really good. So, and I got more bottles too.
Okay.
My wife knows all too well. Unfortunately, a lot of money going to the bottle collection.
We got to get you an NIL deal then. So you've already shouted out. Okay, Old Forester, you hear him, call him up. You can check out more of his work on Knowles 247. Brendan, thank you so much for all of that great perspective.